Hello, welcome to Southeast Asia Speaks. I'm Marites Vitug. Thank you for joining me. Southeast Asia Speaks is where Southeast Asians can weigh on issues beyond our borders. It's also a show wherein I talk to news personalities and newsmakers on issues affecting the region. We will be joined by Ruben Carranza, an international human rights lawyer based in New York. He works with the International Center for Transitional Justice, and we will talk to him about the new prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, who will assume office on June 16. So welcome, Ruben, and thank you so much for joining us and making time.
I'm happy to be here and happy to respond to your questions, Marites.
Yes, first of all, since we're watching the International Criminal Court, why was the choice of Karim Khan controversial? But he's well known as a defense counsel and also a counsel for victims. But why was his choice controversial?
Well, part of the controversy comes from the procedure for electing the prosecutor. So it's not about Karim Khan in terms of the procedure. It's about how the countries that are part of the ICC elect the next prosecutor. Normally, and by normally I mean in the last two prosecutors, the election is in effect by consensus. But in this third prosecutor, they could not agree on a candidate. And so the process was also democratized by allowing more participation from civil society groups, mostly non-government organizations from different regions, to participate in the interviews, to participate in the vetting of nominees, and then to send those nominee recommendations to the ICC Assembly of States Parties. What happened was that the procedure led to a short list that, according to some, excluded what they thought were qualified persons, but according to others, was a list that was arrived at with this more democratized procedure. So the disagreement was over procedure. And to some extent, of course, the disagreement was over the persons mostly not on the list rather than in the list, which brings us to the second reason why he's controversial, because in effect, he was incorporated into the list. There were allegations that he was backed by certain more powerful ICC member states to be nominated and eventually to be elected as prosecutor. But the most important reason for the controversy is, of course, his background. He's a defense lawyer. He has defended certain individuals before the ICC who were alleged to have committed crimes against humanity. But I also think that that's actually the least important reason to make a controversy out of his election.
So he starts office in June. In the meantime, does he need to? What has he, or what to you should he be doing to, shall we say, hasten the processes in the ICC? I think, Ruben, the cases there take a long time, no, before they are resolved, and there have only been, he's the third prosecutor only in the short history of the ICC. So what does he need to do to like energize maybe the office of the prosecutor?
Well, to be fair, the problems of the ICC arise mainly from the fact that it's under-resourced, and then as a second problem, that it still has to gain the kind of credibility that it should have as an international criminal court, primarily through the selection of cases to prosecute and the cases to not prosecute. So those are, on one hand, a material problem, the other is a political problem. And these are problems that the prosecutor has a role to play in terms of solving, but really cannot do on his or her own. Prosecutor Bensouda, I think, has, to her credit, tried to do her best to help find solutions to the problem of funding. And in the last couple of months, and perhaps all the way to till the end of her term as prosecutor, I think she has been able to energize the ICC with her selection of cases to prosecute more recently. And I think these are the foundations for the next prosecutor to build on. So Karim Khan will have to build on what Prosecutor Bensouda has done in terms of the political legitimacy of the ICC. And I think that's both going to be an opportunity for him, but potentially, given the controversies that led to his election, might also be a challenge for him. So uh, he has to be able to show some continuity with the choices that his predecessor made in terms of selecting cases, but he also has to harness the office of the prosecutor as a as an agency that can mobilize funding for the court among its member states.
What's also interesting, Ruben, of course you know this, is that Karim Khan was a trainer or trained the Commission on Human Rights lawyers and staff on best practices of investigating. But apart from that, that was in 2018. Apart from that, he trained some of the Philippine judges, court attorneys, lawyers of the Solicitor General and other government offices in 2016 on international criminal law. So does this make him quite familiar then with the Philippines and how our judicial system works? I'm asking because we have a pending situation or case in the ICC.
Well, in general, I think his familiarity with the ICC will help him in his job. He knows the ICC rules of practice and procedure, but more importantly, he knows that these rules of practice and procedure at the court are still evolving. So, in our work in ICTJ, those who work on international justice, we often talk about hybrid courts. So, the Cambodia Khmer Rouge court or the court in Rwanda or in Yugoslavia, those are hybrid courts, but they're also ad hoc courts. They're not permanent. They've closed down, or in the case of Cambodia, it's still going on, but it will eventually close. On the other hand, the ICC is a permanent hybrid court. So one of the advantages of Karim Khan, like many other lawyers who not only practice at the ICC but have defended those who are charged with crimes against humanity or war crimes at the ICC, is this familiarity with procedure. But your question is about the familiarity with the Philippine situation. And to some extent, that of course is helpful. And to the extent that he knows that there is a situation and that the situation has arisen from the war on drugs carried out by Rodrigo Duterte, then that familiarity will serve him well. The only reservation I would have is that it might also be a reason for him to be more cautious than necessary in making decisions about the Philippine situation. And I think this is where a larger question comes up. The legacy of an ICC prosecutor largely depends not just on the cases that he or she selects to prosecute, but also on the cases that he or she selects not to prosecute. And I think here, and as I said earlier, he has to build on the foundations already built by his predecessor. And one of those foundations is the decision to open a preliminary examination in the Philippines, to not just carry on the process of examining and perhaps leading to an investigation in the Philippines, but Fatou Bensouda actually exercised the powers of the prosecutor to warn Philippine officials as early as 2018 that this war on drugs could lead to prosecution. And I think that's a very important role that the prosecutor can take. That's a power that a prosecutor has. This power of threatening to prosecute, this power of warning individuals, warning governments that he or she has the power to hold them accountable, uh, even if they have immunity in their own country, even if their domestic law prevents them from being held accountable, they can be held accountable at the ICC. And that's a power that the prosecutor has and that Karim Khan will have, and hopefully he will exercise it.
Oh, that's very interesting, Ruben, because last December, Fatou Bensouda in her report said that her office, uh, I think, is scheduled to decide whether they will proceed with the full investigation first half of the year. So I'm assuming that maybe there may be a decision before Karim Khan takes over. This just hypothetically. Let's just say that the prosecutor decides to open a full probe, and then the Philippine government has said, Duterte has said, that he will not allow any of the ICC staff or officials to visit the Philippines to investigate. So how can the ICC or the prosecutor fulfill its duty to investigate a situation?
Well, in the Rome Statute, the states that are members of the ICC are obligated to cooperate with the court. And this theoretical obligation to cooperate means that when the ICC prosecutor seeks evidence, for example, the law enforcement agencies of that member state have to cooperate in the search for evidence, in the validation of documents or testimony that the ICC prosecutor needs. Now, the Philippines withdrawal means that the Philippines is no longer a member state of the ICC, and that took effect in 2019. But there is an argument to be made that the Philippines situation having been already open and an examination having been already started, and there is jurisprudence, in fact, at the ICC that says that an examination that's already opened can proceed, even if the state being examined has withdrawn from the ICC. This is the Burundi case. So that this fact, the fact that there is a pending preliminary examination in the Philippines that could lead to a formal investigation, arguably means that the Philippines is still bound to cooperate, at least with respect to this investigation, if it happens. So even if the Philippine government under Rodrigo Duterte right now announces that it will not cooperate and it will likely not cooperate, that fact does not mean that it has ceased to have an obligation to cooperate. Having said that, that obviously makes it difficult for any prosecutor, whether it's Fatou Bensouda or Karim Khan, to proceed with getting evidence from Philippine agencies, or even to be present in the Philippines to interview witnesses, for example, or to extend protection to witnesses. But there are always ways around that. And not just at the ICC, but even in UN commissions of inquiry, even in investigations carried out in countries that have exercised jurisdiction over war crimes and crimes against humanity elsewhere, there are ways to still conduct investigations, to interview witnesses, to protect them even. And there are ways as well to obtain documentation that can be used as evidence in a criminal prosecution, including, of course, whistleblower provided evidence, which in the Philippines case is possible. You have whistleblowers who have come forward. So this isn't an insurmountable obstacle. The threats by Rodrigo Duterte to not just not allow ICC investigators to come in, but to even harm them, might in fact even be considered evidence, perhaps not necessarily of guilt, but evidence that the documents, the testimony, all other material proof that is being withheld from the Philippines will be contrary to proclamations of innocence by those who might eventually be charged. So this is a long-standing rule in criminal prosecution. And this could even be interpreted against those in the Philippines who might be charged before the ICC.
Yeah, I don't know, Ruben, if you followed this, but there's been a case in the Philippine Supreme Court questioning the unilateral withdrawal of Duterte from the ICC. And I think yesterday or a couple of days ago, the Supreme Court dismissed the petition, saying it's moot. Although we haven't read yet the decision, but just superficially, the court said it's a moot case. So, but this will not affect the process now that has started in the ICC.
The problem with the Supreme Court of the Philippines saying that it's this constitutional question of whether a president can, on his own, withdraw from a treaty in which the Senate has concurred, has participated in terms of approving the country's ratification and accession to that treaty. This kind of case will never be moot because there are many other treaties in which this could happen in the future. Now, if the Philippine Supreme Court is arguing that it's in this particular case, the ICC treaty, that has become moot because it has taken effect, that's an even larger problem because this isn't just any ordinary treaty in which the consequences are, for instance, similar to if you were to withdraw from the Postal Union Treaty, so your mail gets delayed, or if you were to withdraw from treaties involving satellites, in which case your access to television will be affected. This is about life or death. And so it's the Supreme Court effectively saying that Filipinos are not important in terms of accountability. Filipinos don't have access to international justice as represented by the ICC or even to other forms of international justice because their president can simply say, we don't want Filipinos to be able to seek justice elsewhere if they can't find justice in the Philippines. And for this to come from the Philippine Supreme Court can, in fact, be seen as the Philippine Supreme Court being complicit in defending impunity, in ensuring that Rodrigo Duterte isn't held accountable. This does not mean, however, that this decision can't be revisited in the future. It might take a while. It might take several justices later to revisit this question of whether a president can unilaterally withdraw from a human rights obligation, because this has repercussions not only in terms of the ICC or in terms of international criminal justice. This has repercussions on economic and social rights, for example. The Philippines is a party to the Convention on Economic and Social Rights. The Philippines is a party to the Convention Against Torture. So does this mean that Rodrigo Duterte can withdraw from the Convention Against Torture and cannot be held accountable if the military or the police commit torture in the Philippines and cannot be prosecuted in the country? So this can be revisited in the future. But more importantly, this does not stop the ICC from proceeding to an investigation, from prosecuting those who might end up being charged for crimes against humanity in the Philippines or from conducting a trial. This simply means that the Supreme Court of the Philippines does not want to participate in strengthening accountability in its own country.
Thank you, Ruben, for that. That's quite an interesting point because we've been also thinking of the independence of the Philippine Supreme Court. As you know, it's a very times have changed here in the Philippines. But related to that, okay, so in the meantime, they said it's moot. Is there another, let's say hypothetically, if the ICC decides not to open an investigation on the Philippine situation, can victims also use the universal jurisdiction principle? Can they seek justice through another avenue outside the ICC?
Well, first, it's important to capture the idea of universal jurisdiction. It simply means that a country can exercise jurisdiction through its courts, through its investigators, over a criminal case committed or a crime committed in another country if that crime were of such a universal character in that it's considered a crime against humanity, a war crime, or genocide, international crimes, crimes that the world or the community of nations considers so atrocious that any of them should be able to prosecute those crimes. Now, that sweeping description of universal jurisdiction, however, is not actually universal. Not all countries exercise universal jurisdiction, and even the few countries left that continue to exercise universal jurisdiction have scaled down the extent of the exercise of universal jurisdiction. And some of them have even been they were already selective in the past. They have become even more selective about which cases to prosecute within the context of universal jurisdiction. Having said that, too, it is possible for victims of the war on drugs, Filipinos whose family members were killed without due process, tortured, or children traumatized by the killing of their family members. These are all crimes that the ICC prosecutor has said has taken place in the Philippines in her reports on the examinations she's conducting. Using those reports, using, in fact, the data from that examination, Filipinos can actually seek the exercise of universal jurisdiction in another country for as long as that country either has a law or has courts willing to take on these universal jurisdiction cases. And there are a few that in the past have taken on cases from abroad and exercised universal jurisdiction, from Spain as early as the Pinochet case to more recently Germany in cases involving Syrian war criminals, or even Finland in cases involving Liberian war criminals.
But does this mean, Ruben, that the alleged perpetrator should be residents of that country?
Generally, yes. There should be jurisdiction over the person of the perpetrator. In other words, the person can be held accountable within the country for universal jurisdiction to exercise. It doesn't mean that the country exercising universal jurisdiction cannot initiate investigation in any event. In the past, for example, former U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was the subject of a universal jurisdiction investigation in Germany, and or and as a matter of fact, as well as in Belgium, and those countries began investigations of Rumsfeld, even if Rumsfeld was not yet in those countries. So it's possible for a country to begin to exercise universal jurisdiction. There might be issues around due process if it proceed to trial.
Oh, it's very interesting. At least the long arm of the law is there to, warn perpetrators about the possibility of the law catching up with them. One final question, Ruben. So going back to the new ICC prosecutor, do you think, this is a question that people ask, do you think he will be fair? Do you think he will be a pragmatist? Do you think he will be a strong kind of prosecutor? But you said he needs to build on Bensouda's legacy. So anyway, just to tell us what your expectations are and what you think he will do.
In interviews that he had with civil society organizations that have been monitoring ICC cases, and all of the nominees to be prosecutor that were with Karim Khan went through these interviews, Karim Khan made statements that I think showed how he might try to prove himself as prosecutor. One of the statements he made was that he has met with survivor communities, and he's referring to different groups of people from the Yazidi community in Iraq. He heads an investigative body created by the UN to investigate war crimes against the Yazidi people. So he has met with them. He talks about meeting other survivor communities, and he mentions having met with Filipino families who have survived the war on drugs led by Rodrigo Duterte. And I think this is an important statement because this is Karim Khan acknowledging that a prosecutor isn't just a technical, legalistic person who weighs evidence, who considers only the law in determining how he should proceed, but that a prosecutor is someone who has to see what he is or she is investigating from the point of view of those who have suffered the human rights violations, who have suffered the consequences of crimes against humanity committed against them or their family members. So this empathy is important. Karim Khan at the same time carries the baggage of having been supported or perceived to be supported by countries that don't want to be investigated. And in many ways, you can argue that Karim Khan has to prove that he is above the interests of these countries. So when I said that he has to build on the foundations that Fatou Bensouda has started, these are cases such as the investigation of US war crimes committed in Afghanistan or the war crimes committed by Israel in occupied Palestine. These are cases that Fatou Bensouda has opened, and so Karim Khan has to decide how to proceed in those cases. In the Philippine situation, it's only at the level of preliminary examination. There is a possibility that Fatou Bensouda might decide the way she has decided Afghanistan, for example, to open an investigation into the Philippines before her term ends in June. And so there is still some period to wait and see what she will do in the Philippines case and what Karim Khan will then have to decide or will then have to do if and when Fatou Bensouda opens an investigation into the Philippines.
It's fascinating talking to you, Ruben. Thank you so much. And on that note, I just want to recap, tell our viewers and our listeners that on June, we hope to expect an announcement from the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC, that's Bensouda, before she steps down. And then Karim Khan takes over on June 16. So we're all waiting here in the Philippines with bated breath on what will happen in June at the ICC. And as Ruben mentioned, we're also excited about Karim Khan having ex- met with survivors, not only here in the Philippines, but in other countries. So, on that note, we're both hopeful and also anxious. Thank you so much, Ruben, and we will continue this conversation. I'm sure there will be many more issues to talk about in the future. Uh,
Salamat din.
yeah, thank you very much, and thank you again for joining us.